All right, Herle Burlyites, it's time to get our pod on. This one is recorded less than 12 hours after the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs played their climactic Game 7 in the battle for the Laurentian Cup. Even better than a Stanley Cup, because it isn't just champagne that's guzzled out of the Laurentian Cup, it's power. Vancouver cannot win the Laurentian Cup. Calgary, Edmonton, and Winnipeg can't win it. Theoretically, Ottawa could win it, but not with this ownership. We've got a two-parter on the docket today. Part one is the return of one of our most listened to podcasts, Frances Donald. If you'll recall, Miss Donald is Managing Director, Global Chief Economist, and Global Head of Macroeconomic Strategy at Manulife Investment. I don't know what anybody else does in that joint. And we're going to talk about what else? The budget. Did we all forget about the budget already? Where's it going to take us this next year? Are there longer-term growth elements in the budget? What's the potential for rising inflation and rising interest rates? Part two of the podcast is the ever-insightful, consistently profane, mostly hilarious, if you like a bit of sandpaper with your hilarity, our political panel with strategists and comms gurus Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid. We're going to talk about the Habs, naturally. Big win last night. Tremendously emotionally satisfying. After that, the reverse. The devastating residential school tragedy in British Columbia. Then it's the latest Leger numbers in Ontario showing 4-34. Liberals at 26 and the NDP at 25. Are these numbers real and what do they mean? Will Amos is stepping aside and officially seeking professional help for peeing in a cup on camera. We'll chat about that. And then it's Carney versus Poilievre, the biggest show in Ottawa, next to Will Amos's urine, I mean. Plus, we'll throw out our hey yous into the digital ether. But first, Frances Donald, welcome back to the Herle Burly. Thanks for doing this again. How are you?
I'm great. The Montreal Canadiens are moving onwards. I've had a vaccine. I can just picture the oysters I'm going to eat when I go back to the restaurants eventually when it's safe and appropriate. So things are looking up, I think.
Yes, I think everybody's in a better mood. Did you watch the game last night?
No, you know what I did? I went for a walk because I have so little time when I'm not either in front of a computer or parenting or doing laundry. But what was really precious is as I walked around this suburban neighborhood, I could see the game on in televisions across the entire neighborhood. In every window I would look through, and I thought, this is sweet. As I was telling you earlier, I'm no longer a 16-year-old in search of a boyfriend. Therefore, I have moved on to my own personal interests and not just following sports to liked and appreciated by others. But I'm still very excited as a Montrealer that the Canadiens have moved forward. So all good things, community is good. And of course, you may remember in years where we've had sports teams do very well, it has actually boosted GDP. So reasons to be watching sports beyond personal relationship status.
Absolutely. I don't mean to be room raider or anything, Frances, but who's supposed to be sitting in that chair next to you?
Oh, it's all the wisdom I've collected over the years. It's just right there. Can't you see it?
Just sitting right there so you can draw on it.
Listen, when we're what, month 16 here? So I have done a substantial amount, over 200 client presentations. I wanted something that looked fairly neutral behind me. And also this chair, I got it from Wayfair and the leg is broken. So they said I could dispose of it. And I thought, it's a lovely prop. But you can't sit on it. So there you go. If you want to room raider me 2 on 10, that's fine.
I'm going to report you to room raider after that.
Fair.
So listen, Frances, I have a bunch of things that are on my mind, but let's start with what's on your mind. You're canvassing what's going on in the world economy all the time. And what is catching your attention these days? What's interesting? What's going on out there?
There's a lot that's interesting, but one of the challenges as we go forward into the summer is that economists have a lot of theories of how things are supposed to progress. And a lot of it is theory because so much of what we're experiencing right now is indeed unprecedented. So not just the largest recession we've seen in modern time, but coming out of the largest recession we've seen in modern time. What happens when an economy reopens? What about all these supply chain disruptions? We could talk about used cars in the US rising 10% every month is the price changes that are happening there. And so now we're sitting and we're waiting for the data to either prove or dispute a lot of theories. And that basically means that we are effectively sitting ducks as we wait to see who was right and who was wrong. So it's either a very good time to take a vacation over the course of the summer, or it's a good time to maybe focus on some longer term themes. And that is probably where my head has been at the last month and over the summer. I think we maybe need to start thinking out not just what the next 3 months looks like, but what the next 5 to 10 years looks like.
That's interesting, because, not to get right into it, but I will, because you led me right there, which is, that was, if there was a critique of the federal budget, it was that it didn't have that 3 to 5 year vision in it. That it was very strong at income support, and had a very well lauded initiative in childcare, but a lot of people struggled to find the growth strategy in that budget. Is there a growth strategy in the budget?
Well, there's two main elements to this budget that I feel are relevant and affect my outlook for Canada. And then there's a lot of stuff that doesn't really change my view. So there are reasons why you might want to laud that. So, for example, should everything in a budget be about boosting GDP? I don't think so. I think sometimes we just want to make people's lives better for other reasons that are not economics focused. The first one is income support, as you said. We are still in the greatest economic crisis in the past 100 years. And we haven't felt it. It doesn't feel like it to the same extent because of these income supports. Now, you might remember, or you may still be in, I think you're in Ontario, Dave, I'm not sure, but still one of the most strict lockdowns in the world, and still substantial amount of support needed. If we had pulled that support too early, we could have seen almost a retracement of some of the benefits that the government supported in the past year. So that's a worthwhile spend. And yep. I have repeatedly said, I've said it to the government, I have said it on television, I've said it on podcasts, the dangers, the damages of pulling income support too early far outweigh the damages of extending a few months too long. But the second element really is long-term focused, and that's the childcare component of this budget. Now, we don't know exactly what childcare will look like. We need the provinces to get involved. But every time I run a model, every time I try to forecast GDP, revenue, labor force participation rates, and we include some form of affordable, accessible childcare, I get improved outcomes. I think a lot of people look at me and they say, oh, she's 35-year-old with a 3-year-old. She only cares about childcare because it's a big part of her life right now. And daycare payments aren't for forever. But actually, no, that's not it. I started looking at childcare when I was covering Japanese equities in 2013. Because Japanese equities in 2013, Premier Abe comes in and he says, if I'm going to boost the economy, I have to increase female labor force participation rate. And he started talking about what he called womenomics. And he, developed a whole bunch of different elements to try to get more women involved in the labor force. And in doing so, we increasingly modeled that would improve Japanese growth. And that was actually a reason to buy Japanese stocks. It was literally one of the theses at the time. And at the time I started thinking, well, wait a second. If you could improve female labor force participation rate, you could actually improve the economy. And this is a reason to be bullish. So since then, I've put a lot of emphasis on things like labor force participation rates. And the childcare component of this budget is not a woman's issue. It's a broad economic issue that should do a myriad of things if successfully implemented, including boost how many people work, men and women, improve wages for just about everyone, improve outcomes for the children themselves, boost GDP, and boost revenue for governments, provincial and federal as well. I also think it will help business competitiveness. Why? Because we need to attract and retain labor in Canada. And if we can make it seem like a good deal, a nice place to live, then it helps businesses as well. That said, there are some things missing in this budget. Can't do everything in every budget. One is we need urgent help on housing. It's a crisis now, no question in my mind. And we need to do more to support businesses. Can you do everything in every budget? No. But the next budget for me has to be focused on those two areas, or else I will become increasingly nervous about where we're going with the size of government and where it's focused.
Okay, so a couple things I want to pick at there. The first is, on the childcare thing, I haven't heard anybody criticize that. Like, I didn't even hear conservatives criticizing that. Like, that just seems to be, everybody agrees that that was a good thing to do. However, a year ago, a lot of people were talking about the fact that this was a she-cession, not a recession, and that women were the primary losers of employment in this COVID downturn, and that we needed childcare to get women back into the workforce. But this is not happening on any time frame that's going to help anybody that was affected by this recession. There does not appear to be any urgency to the childcare initiative in terms of being a factor now.
Some of that is sheer practicality. How are you going to build out spots in the next 6 months? Now, from my perspective, it is, so the term she-cession, which was coined by Armin Yalnizyan, who's one of my most favorite economists to cover on this topic, is appropriate in that this disproportionately hurt women, particularly compared to past recessions. And we also know that the lack of childcare, reliable childcare, and virtual learning suppressed labor force participation rates. Now, this happened much more in the United States than in Canada. But the best way around that in the near term is vaccines and a reopening. If you want to get women back to work, then you need to bring back the jobs that supported women. If you need virtual learning to stop dampening women's labor force participation, then we have to have a healthy, robust recovery. So from a sheer practicality component, the best way to support women and men and children is get the vaccines in the arm and or reopen the economies in a safe way. Maybe they're not exactly the same. And then the other challenge we have is when we look at globally, vaccines do not equal reopening. So we've seen some economies that are very far ahead on vaccines who have been very slow in their reopening. I would say Ontario is in that camp as well, very cautious. And then we have other places where vaccines have been slower. So certain parts of the United States where they've moved ahead with reopening very quickly. So we are entirely empirically correct that this recession disproportionately hurt women, particularly compared to past ones. And it's empirically correct that we need better childcare to heal that. But that to me is not, how are we going to open hundreds of thousands of childcare spots in the next 3 months? It's not entirely realistic. But it did open up the conversation. Dave, years ago when I would talk about this, I would write on Twitter, hey, we could benefit from childcare. Just the mean tweets that would come at me, like, you evil socialist, what a communist, how are we going to pay for that? The fact that, nobody said this is ridiculous, and the arguments that we see, the most heated debates on childcare are not, should we have it? It's how should it be designed? That's such a big, big change. And there are economists, women and men who have fought for childcare for decades who deserve a lot of praise for bringing the conversation here. I still, however, sometimes hear people say, if you want to have children, then you should bear the cost of that. That's true. What we worry about is when the cost of childcare prohibits population growth, when it reduces corporate competitiveness, when it eats into our ability to spend and boost the economy in other ways. That's my perspective. In some ways, Dave, I'm a heartless, dark Bay Street advocate for childcare. My goal is to boost growth. That's been my angle the whole time. And that's why I'm not going to opine on how it should be designed. There are experts in that area. What I can tell you is no matter how I slice it, there are improved economic outcomes. For every dollar you spend, you get at least $1.50, sometimes as high as $2 back. This is good policy. Now it has to be, like so many other policies, designed appropriately, implemented, not railroad. And that's for your political podcast component to discuss, I suppose.
There you go. I'm no oracle, but it strikes me that as we're coming closer to seeing the end of the pandemic, the stuff we've gotten used to doing online, shopping, meetings, running businesses, medical appointments, will still be a bigger part of our lives. So it's critical that all Canadians, no matter where we live, have the connectivity we need. That's the mission of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, to make digital connectivity more powerful and reliable, and to connect as many Canadians as possible living in remote, rural, and Indigenous communities. A perfect example of this is TELUS bringing pure fiber to the people of Esketam, who've lived on their traditional territory in central BC since time immemorial. The ability to connect to culture, rooted in connection to the land, and to the wisdom of their ancestors and traditional teachings, is a key priority for the Escot and their government. It used to be that the ability to attend community meetings online for members living further afield or with limited mobility was impossible because of the dreaded buffering. Now, with Pure Fibre, the government seamlessly broadcasts town halls, council meetings, and cultural events so that everyone can participate in real time. Do I even have to mention that all of this became even more critical with the COVID-19 stay-at-home order? Digital connectivity allowed the community to keep everyone, especially elders, safe. This kind of work and its benefits ramps way up with the arrival of faster, more powerful 5G technology in this country, which is why TELUS is partnering with federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments to bring 5G to even more urban, rural, and remote communities. You can find out more at telus.com/5G. So the $30 million for childcare was uncontroversial, I would suggest. But I've had some pretty smart people on this podcast who've been unable to explain to me what the other $70 billion of the $100 billion stimulus fund is for. And that's where the criticism about the lack of a industrial strategy comes in. Is a lot of money, $70 billion, some here, some there, some for this fishery, some for that digital fund, didn't appear as a strategy. Are we missing something?
Well, I don't see that either in this budget, but I'm not sure how many large strategies you can have. What I think is most telling is, so let me walk you through an economist on budget day. Okay. So historically, you would go line up in Ottawa and there'd be long lines and you'd see all the people that you've met throughout your career and be like, oh, that guy didn't hire me, or I did a great project with this person, very gossipy. You bring snacks, by the way, because it's a full-on lockup. You go in this thing and you're isolated into booths, usually with a certain media group. So for example, I've gone with BNN. Snacks are important, as I said. In fact, I remember going into the lockup with terrible morning sickness when I was pregnant with my son and having to run to the bathroom while reading this hundreds of page report, in between trying to make graphs, run, come back. That was a tough lockup. So when you're doing this, you're writing up your whole report and you're looking for the most important numbers. You're looking for the fiscal anchor. You're looking for how much money is total spent. You're looking for the biggest programs that have the biggest bang for their buck, and you don't have internet access. So you're trying to run these through your Excel spreadsheets that you've all made, and then you're giving your media quotes of things that you think are relevant. And then when it's released, you're on your phone, or I'm on my phone with my Bloomberg app open, looking for the market reaction. How much are rates going to move? Because the global reaction to this budget is what becomes significant. It can move the Canadian dollar. If the global investors lose confidence in Canada's ability to repay or change its growth strategy, there are algos and economists who within minutes of this release coming out will be moving the market if there's anything significant. So this year, there was a virtual lockup. I didn't participate. I was over here with my wisdom chair, waiting at 4 o'clock for the budget to be released. And I'm looking at my screens, waiting to see the little ticker move. I see 100 billion flash across my screens, and I immediately instinctively go to look at the bond market, and the market doesn't move. I think my screen is broken. I look at the Canadian dollar, almost no reaction. I'm looking to the side here because that's where my screen is, and I'm going through it in my head. In any case, and then I start looking, where's the fiscal anchor? Where's the fiscal anchor? And I don't see one. And yet the bond market is not moving. So here is the most powerful message from this budget. And it's a multi-pronged one. The fact that global markets didn't respond to this budget can tell you a few things. One, as bond traders would say, it was already priced. So the market was expecting a number of this size. That could be one. Two, it views the spending within this budget as appropriate. Stem the damage of the current crisis. Invest with childcare, which even the darkest heart Wall Streeters know is actually a good thing for your economy. Or there's a third component to this, which is that global markets know now and anticipate that governments are going to be much larger segment of our economy. Canada is not isolated in how much money it's spending here. Year-over-year changes, yes. You compare to pre, yes. But in terms of aggregate size of government, we're seeing the US catch up very, very quickly. Overall, governments are becoming far more powerful. So did it matter that it didn't have a fiscal anchor? To a lot of Canadians, probably. Last time we talked, I told you, I don't think we need a fiscal anchor from a market perspective in this budget, because the market is focused on, can you save this economy and move forward with growth? That said, I think this is the last year where we get away with it. After this year, the crisis will be over. We will have to see something more substantial for bond markets to have faith in that level of spending. Perhaps more importantly, we also can't contract too quickly. The US is going into a sizable problem at the end of 2022 and into 2023, which is they're going to see the largest drop in government spending, actually the third largest in the last 100 years, and the largest outside of wartime period. What is that going to do? Your major growth impulse is going to fall back very, very quickly. Canada actually has to avoid that, because what it has to orchestrate in the next, I would say, 3 years is a transition from government spending to private spending. The US has to do this as well, and it needs a plan for that. Otherwise, by the time they have to pull back because they don't want interest spendings to come too high, there will be a giant hole of spending in the economy. Who's going to provide the income support? Who's going to make sure renters can actually rent? Who's going to make sure we're attracting and retaining businesses and people? We need a plan for that. We probably have another year to develop it, and then we won't. So your question was, and I know I've ranted here, is there missing? We got away with what we could get away with this year with minimal market reaction. The market did not boost our interest rates. The market did not slam our Canadian dollar. This is the last year we can do that. So there's a bit of breathing room. And in some ways, I would say the government was right to maybe fill all the little holes that it wanted to fill for a variety of reasons, spend on one big plan, which was politically a little bit difficult, make sure to stem the crisis, do the right thing in the right year. It's not a perfect budget, but this year, I think it fit the bill. And the market reaction tells me that.
Do you think their fiscal forecasts are correct, or does this permanently larger government that you're talking about require more revenue?
What we need to do is bake in much higher confidence intervals. So no economist should feel confident in their outlook right now. We are in completely uncharted territory. Like, one very good example is in the past couple of months, we have noticed that supply chain disruptions are getting extreme. So you've probably heard of the chip shortages, semiconductors, right? These are creating widespread problematic developments. My neighbor wants to put in a pool. They don't have any liners. We had to get a new car. We're suburban now, so we need cars. It's like part of the evolution, I guess. And we went to go get a new car.
An SUV. You need an SUV. You don't need a car.
Of
you got
course,
an SUV,
right?
presumably.
I just signed my kid up for soccer. 3-year-olds have soccer in the suburbs. I don't know if you knew this. This is it's my education. And so we could manage to get the car, but they didn't have the wheels. These are some examples of some of the shortages that we're seeing because of these demand supply imbalances. But we've never seen this before. And what we're witnessing globally is that it's actually restraining the amount that the economy can produce over time. And this is the result of manipulating our economy. Like, used cars come up all the time. I spend so much time reading about used cars. Who would have thought? What happened with used cars? Used cars, essentially, there's a massive shortage and prices are rising because last year, rental car companies basically thought, oh crap, we're doomed. If we're going to make our payments, we got to sell our whole lot of used cars, because who's going to be taking a trip? Like, am I going to drive up to Quebec City in a used car in the middle of a pandemic? Absolutely not. Borders were shut. So they sell off all of it. Then what happens? Vaccines come back faster, and everybody says, well, actually, I don't want to go on a plane. I'll rent a car and drive to a cottage country, for example. So demand skyrockets. Now, in addition to that, weird things happen. So typically in recessions, if people lose their job, they tend to sell their car and they take public transit. Well, if you're afraid of getting COVID, you're not taking public transit. So even the lower incomes were looking for purchasing cars. And then where do we get a lot of stock of used cars? Repossessions. Guess how many repossessions they are? They're tanking. Almost no repossessions. Strange in a recession. Why? Because people had stimulus checks. So they were making their car payments. These are all little manipulations of the market that create these huge demand supply blockages. And that's just one example. So why do I say, we have to be very careful with forecasts from finance to private sector economists? Because this has to dislodge. And I'm not as convinced as maybe others that it's all upside risk. I think that we may be at a point where even consumer confidence is starting to be weighed down by the expectation that prices are rising. Even people, who weren't paying attention to food prices notice that, oh my gosh, like these grapes were more, or that cost me a lot to fill my tank, or maybe I can't go to cottage country because gas prices are starting to be high. So these supply chain disruptions are really difficult to predict, and they're having an impact. I don't know if you heard about this, Dave, but so I'm in the West Island of Montreal. There's 2 bridges that go into the West Island of Montreal, and one of them, the Île-aux-Torts Bridge, because of human error, apparently, they had to close it. So all of the traffic that goes between Ontario and the US into Montreal got diverted to a 2-lane highway with stoplights on it. It crushed the entire western part. 75% of the trade between Ontario, the US, and Quebec goes over these 2 lanes highways with traffic lights. So that's a supply chain disruption. There was traffic, miles and miles into the city because people were trying to divert. That hits the economy. Now imagine that happening on a global scale. This is lost production that I'm not sure we get back. And it really affects our ability to predict where we go next. So whatever the forecast is, we have to recognize there's a variety of possibilities, very wide confidence intervals, and we certainly shouldn't be making decisions, private, public, corporate, personal, based on an expectation or a high conviction view that everything is going to be amazing in the next 3 to 6 months. Maybe that's what happens, but now is the time to have prudent forecasts. Now I'm going to tell you one last thing. I don't book CNBC interviews by saying, well, there's a variety of possibilities and I'm neutral. No, you don't get on TV by saying that, but that's the prudent way to be operating.
Right. So, well, the government, though, seems to have placed a pretty big bet fiscally that things are going to work out. And part of that has to do with interest rates. And I know that your point of view, and if you could explain this to me, it would be helpful, is that the price increases that citizens are seeing everywhere from food to lumber to gasoline are not inflationary in a way that would drive rates, but are responses to specific developments. Is that right?
Yes, but maybe my conviction on that has changed over the last 6 months. I've had an evolution in thinking, which I think is fair and one should admit. So when we think about inflation, the way to think about inflation, broad-based and persistent, is when demand for everything exceeds supply for everything on a continuous basis. What we're seeing now is extreme demand-supply mismatches in certain areas. Lumber. Have you tried to build anything with wood lately? It's insane. 600% increases in wood. You can't even get it. My neighbor's trying to do a renovation. He's had to halt the renovation because they're missing, forgive me, I'm no carpenter, joists. They just can't even get the little joists that stick the woods together. There are other areas where we see supply-demand mismatches like semiconductors, used cars, for example. These are largely because of COVID-specific issues. We don't have a shortage of trees. Well, lumber economics is its whole thing, and some people say we should make more trees available to cut down. Some people say the opposite. No, what slowed down was that there was a shortage of people to then turn those trees into lumber. There was a shortage of rail cars to bring this stuff across. When COVID resolves itself, hopefully, if that happens, then those demand-supply mismatches should ease. And then you won't see the same sort of prices. Fence prices will come down. My neighbor will be able to get his joist. And the issue is the Bank of Canada can hike rates as much as it wants. That's not going to lower lumber prices. That's not going to make sure that people can come back into the manufacturing plants. They can hike interest rates as much as they want. That's not going to change the used car supply and demand imbalance. Not at all. So interest rates are not the effective policy tool when you have COVID-related demand-supply mismatches. Now, if we were to see let's say those little demand supply mismatches come down, but we all have so much money that we're going out to restaurants. We're still buying Pelotons. Did you get a Peloton? I had to get the knockoff Echelon because I couldn't get a Peloton.
Does it fucking look like I have a Peloton?
Well, I don't know. You have a glow. You seem to
I have a glow and
well.
Yes.
You know, health is not simply about the number on the scale, Dave. It's about how we think and operate, right? You look hardy. So maybe you have a Peloton or an Echelon.
Okay.
In any case, if we start,
I have a Border Collie.
Perfect. That'll work too.
Yeah.
So if demand and supply exceeds, starts to gravitate towards all things for a persistent level of time, and I'm, taking out a HELOC on my house and using it to go on vacations, then higher interest rates can help suppress that level of inflation, but not individual demand supply. Canada has this perception that, we're in control of oil prices and thus our Canadian dollar. Ha ha ha. No, we're not. What happens with oil prices is global demand and supply, OPEC policy decisions. There's a variety. Most of oil prices are driven by global developments. So we can change our interest rate policy all we want. That's not going to help those issues. What it will do is hurt those who are still struggling and coming out of a massive recession, who maybe are losing their income supports but are still unemployed because hundreds of thousands of Canadians are still unemployed. Businesses who have hung on for dear life because of income support and are going to come out the other side with far less cash, maybe still in business, but still suffering. So, my own view here is that the types of inflation we're seeing are not generally the types that benefit and in some ways are further hurt. The other way that we can think about inflation is we tend to think of inflation in isolation, but the better way to think about it is inflation versus growth. Like inflation, if it comes with wage growth, is not a bad thing. If it costs me 3% more to buy my groceries, but I'm earning 3% more, economists don't worry about that. What we worry about is when it costs me 10% more, but I'm not making 10% more, which is what's happening in housing activity right now. So what the Bank of Canada is essentially going to do is it is tapering purchases because we're not in emergency situations anymore. That has boosted the curve a little bit in Canada. But I think they're really going to struggle to raise rates. Governor Macklem seems to be sending the impression that by the end of 2022, he feels like the situation may merit higher rate increases. I think that's going to be really, really hard for them. We're talking today on June 1st. GDP numbers just came out. They disappointed to the downside. This may slow the Bank of Canada's ability to raise rates. So why have I said that I had an evolution of views here? Well, I've had an evolution of views because I listened to our Bank of Canada, and our Bank of Canada is signaling that it sort of wants to raise interest rates to form some form of normalization, probably because of housing. And I can't ignore that. But my view is still that the Bank of Canada can't raise rates until 2023. And even when they do, it's extraordinarily slow. So that does mean that we have to be a little bit more careful about how we think about government money. But I still maintain that we're in one of the lowest interest rates environments we've ever seen. We are at the lowest interest rates we've seen in 5,000 years. We know in Mesopotamia in 2000 BC that interest rates were 20% and they were 4% in Rome in 4 AD. We know that. Never seen interest rates as low as they are now. And that's probably going to persist, even if we, have to suffer through a bunch of articles on Bloomberg about how the Bank of Canada hikes rates by 25 basis points in 2022.
So the opposition critique is that the Bank of Canada is fueling inflation in the country and in particular in the housing sector by the money it's printing and by the inflationary pressures it's creating in the country. Any validity to that?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than just one equals the other. The money it's printing is not likely to be inflationary. So generally, when we think about money printing, in order for money printing to be inflationary, this is the quantity theory of money, it actually has to go into the real economy. But most of the money that we see printed by central banks has either stayed on bank balance sheets or has gone into the stock market. This is huge in the US. We can demonstrate that a lot of money, particularly banks, has gone directly into the markets. So I think there's more validity in the idea that the money printing itself has fueled this asset bubble in the stock market. What has fueled housing is a couple things. One, interest rates are extraordinarily low. So pick your poison. What do you want? Do you want single moms to not be able to feed their children? Do you want to see a depression, or do you want to see uncomfortable price rises in housing? I favor uncomfortable price rises in housing, although now I think we're in an extreme situation that needs to be addressed. But that's the uncomfortable consequence and symptom of a policy we chose to save our economy from a decade or worse of an economic depression. But housing isn't just being generated by that. Housing is also being generated by a complete shift towards what asset managers call real assets. People want to own things, hard things that if you drop on your foot, they hurt. And they want to, because now we're moving towards a work from home type of environment, have more space. In my prior home, I had this setup in my bedroom, and I would put up a big pancarte. Sorry, there's my Quebec coming through. I would put in a big shield between that and my bed so that no one would know I was in my bedroom. Now I moved to a bigger house so I could have an office. This is a trend that's occurring everywhere, and it's a natural human reaction to housing, to the crisis itself. The problem with housing now is we need to start moving away from the idea that house prices that are so disconnected from incomes is just a financials issue. So for years it was, there's a housing bubble, banks are going to collapse. I don't think that's the problem we have with housing. The problem that we have with housing right now is that it's going to start to have a material impact on other areas in our economy. First and foremost, the housing affordability crisis. Let's move forward from bubble. Bubble doesn't mean anything, it just means disconnected from fundamentals. It's a housing affordability crisis. Why? Because it's a youth crisis. If you're under the age of 35 or at any other age and you haven't bought a house and you don't have a huge wealth transfer coming from your parents, you are in deep trouble. You are not going to be owning a house in many areas of this country. This is disproportionately hurting young people. It means you have less income security, you have less security in terms of where you are, and you add to that excessively high childcare prices. Why would you live and work in a place like Toronto? That is the
so
biggest
just can
issue.
Can I stop you for a second? What makes it a crisis? Because it's bad for young people, but fuck them. It's been brilliant for me. My house has doubled in value in Toronto. I've got a whole new retirement plan.
So that's true right now. And this is why we haven't talked about why it's a crisis. But what happens when big companies in Toronto can't hire people, or people who work for them say, you have to pay me materially more in order for me to afford to live here? Then you start getting margin compression. You get an exodus of corporations. You get an exodus of talent that slows your growth over time. So yeah, you might benefit. You're going to benefit from that. But the next generation, the 10 to 20 year economy is not where you are now. Now, what you highlight is a problem because we don't want to disadvantage you. You represent about 70% of Canadians who are already homeowners. But that share is going to shrink gradually over time. And it really worries me of how we're going to keep people in these major urban centers when the costs of living are completely unreasonable. So I think there are some things that we can do to help this. One is we need purpose-built rentals. But two is we need to start encouraging companies to get out of Toronto and Vancouver or have other outposts. There is a massive opportunity here for Calgary, Winnipeg, Montreal, Quebec City, even Ottawa to attract corporations. If you can throw in childcare there, then you will attract some of the best labor in the world, and you'll keep Canadian labor, which is highly skilled, has very high what economists call human capital. It just means we're smart and educated. You can do that. But if we don't start addressing housing, we're going to start seeing that the structure of our economy is changing and the next decade of the economy is substantially weakened. That's why it's a crisis. Not because, banks have to put aside reserves or we'll see a 20% housing correction. Who cares? If house prices fall back 20%, you're still got your fancy new retirement plan. And people who can't afford now can't afford even if we see a 20% correction. The problem is the structural dynamic of this economy, if we have excessively high house prices, is a competitiveness problem, it's a spending problem, and it's a youth crisis.
Interesting. Thanks. I have a group of people that I get together with every couple of weeks and kick around ideas, and many of them are from the West, and they're really interested in obviously climate change and what's happening to the oil and gas industry in Western Canada. And if there's been anything that the budget had a lot of money in there for climate change and climate change adaptation and etc. And the government, in the lead up to a Biden summit a few weeks ago, increased its targets for fossil fuel reductions, greenhouse gas reductions in Canada. And so it is clear that that industry is on its way out the door. And over some relatively rapid period of time, 20, 30 years, that sector's out. What is the impact of that on Canada's standard of living? Not Alberta's standard of living. What is the impact on Canada's standard of living of the disappearance of oil and gas?
Well, there's a variety of long-term implications, one of which is, thank goodness, potentially our Canadian dollar will not just trade alongside oil, so we can actually be on broader fundamentals. But the two is we need a transition. We need to think about other industries that can employ, that can produce growth, that can produce revenue for our country. And one area that I feel is constantly underappreciated is tech. In Canada, we have tremendous amounts of talent, but also what I'll call services exports. So when we think about a service, let's say you go to your accountant does your taxes for you at year end. There is no reason why we couldn't have someone in Detroit hire someone in Toronto if they were appropriately licensed to be doing their taxes. There's no reason that Canadians couldn't be consulting on a variety of different areas, including energy transition in other areas of the world. But we need regulations, we need to have incentives in order to do that. So I hope that if you're correct that oil and gas is on its way out, that what we can do is see the opportunity for transitions. And just like COVID was a little bit of, it shone a light on childcare, and it improved the demand for childcare across a wide range of political spectrums. My hope is that as we have this recognition that we have, a section employed, generating exports, et cetera, that it shines a light on our need to diversify to other industries. But beyond that, I'll say that Canada needs to not just facilitate that transition, it also needs to make sure that it's viewed as a sovereign nation, as a country at the front of the pack on transitions. So by that, I mean the following. I wrote a piece in January that I called Macro Disruptors. 7 things that were disrupting and changing the way we think about, doing macro strategy or economic strategy. And one of them was that we needed to stop thinking about ESG, so that's environment, social governance factors, like climate change, as being a micro or industry specific issue, and need to start recognize that it's actually a macro issue. There are pension funds in Europe that won't buy Alberta provincial bonds because they don't satisfy their ESG criteria within their pension funds. What my concern is if we don't get higher rankings in Canada on our ESG transition, we may actually lose global investors. And you might think, who cares about global investors? Global investors buy our bonds. They invest in the country. They give us money because here's a sad story. We spend more than we make in Canada. We need people to lend us money. And if we don't move faster on ESG...
But that's going to get worse. That's going to get worse because oil and gas is a huge part of our exchange market, right?
Exactly. So there's 2 main drivers of the Canadian dollar. What's happening in global oil prices. And the second is our interest rate differential with the US. So you can see both of those things are global dynamics, right? They're not really in our control. The Bank of Canada can control what our interest rates are, but not what the Federal Reserve is doing in the US. So that's going to change a little bit the dynamics around that. Interestingly, even as oil and gas has become a smaller share of our economy, its structural correlation with the Canadian dollar structural correlation with energy has not moved too much. So the perception is it's still a petrocurrency. But these things shift on a month to month. We have charts that show you this month the Canadian dollar is really correlated with the S&P 500. Next month it might be really well correlated with interest rate differentials. So, it happens on a thing. But what we need to do in this energy transition is make sure that we're front of the pack. And one of the ways to do that is to finance our transition with green bonds. I'm very vocal about this. There is so much global investor demand for green bonds that if you issue green bonds, you make them, a pretty decent.
What's a green bond?
Okay.
What's a green bond?
A green bond is for example, I'll just do simplistically. You say, please lend us money, and it's for this specific project, which is a green type of project, for example. So it's a bond that isn't just for any type of spending, but for green transition spending. And global investors love to buy these because then they can go to their clients. So I can go to someone who buys the Manulife mutual fund and I could say, if you care about ESG standards, we don't just buy generic bonds. We buy bonds that are facilitating the transition to the new economy that is greener and safer. I cannot overstate how much demand there is for this. It is so much thirst that you issue a green bond. Europe, 1/3 of its recovery package is green bonds. People can't buy enough of them. So this is what we have to do. We have to move away from the idea that, we're going to lose jobs here and we have to transition to how can we finance and structurally develop an economy that doesn't just mean we get lots of funding to do it, but avoids the pitfalls of losing funding because we're not moving quickly enough. This is the big concern. People ask me all the time, what is the biggest difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in your forecasts? It's actually green spending. Green spending and green infrastructure, that's the biggest change between the two administrations in any type of forecast that I put together.
All right, that was all super interesting, but I'm not going to let you get away with that happy talk because I'm trying to get a simple truth out on the table. And if you disagree with it, tell me. But the fact that we had oil and gas in our geography was a natural advantage that was unique to that circumstance. And we had something highly valuable that was rare in the world. And that was a significant pillar of our prosperity. Nothing is going to come along to replace that. We may get clever at some technology industries, but we're never going to have that same kind of competitive advantage. So one of the realities of the successful fight against climate change is that Canada is a poorer country than it was before. Correct?
Disagree, because, it depends. There's a variety of avenues. So are we slowly seeing the disintegration of one area? Yes, but that's not just climate change, right? Like, where did all this extra supply came from? The US. We're not the only people in the world with oil. The US shale industry surged. So it wasn't that just climate change came along and suddenly, we're not allowed to have our resources. It's that other people found these resources and managed to exploit them in a way that allowed them to transport, develop them more cheaply. That's the real kicker here. Not, we're not allowed to do oil and gas anymore. So the transition here is not just, we lost out on something that no one else has. No, other people have that too, and they've been managed to use it in better ways. What we can do, and I mean this, Canada has another major advantage, and we can empirically demonstrate this, is that we have an incredibly educated, I was just going to say smart, it's the same word, but we have very skilled population here. We have some of the highest immigration rates. And usually what we see is skilled immigration coming through. We have the potential to be at the forefront of developing the next sectors. And having that level of skilled population is also a massive competitive advantage. But let me put it this way. We could have all the oil and gas in the world sitting in the western part of Canada. And if we weren't exploiting it properly, that would be a problem. Right now, Canada is sitting on one of the highest educated, highly skilled populations in the world, and I don't think we're exploiting it properly. So yes, we're hit with a downside, unequivocally a downside, but we have the ability to capitalize on it. And that is my French bulldog, Louis, just in the background, if you can hear him, with an exclamation point at the end of my sentence.
Way to go, Louis. Way to go, Louis. So then that takes me back to a discussion we were having. A look at Louis. Awesome.
He's always wanted to be on the Herle Burly podcast.
There he is. There he is. We'll make sure he gets him some promos. So This takes me back to a question. When I was a young person, first following Canadian politics, there was a term people used called industrial strategy. And then the term industrial strategy disappeared for 20, 25 years. Nobody uttered it other than to curse it or dismiss it. Seems to be coming back a little bit into vogue. Do you believe that the government should have a strategy about what that future is and lay some bets down on it's going to be digital this or it's going to be environmental that, and really put a big focus behind those things? Or are you not a believer in government industrial strategies and think we should let the market drive these things more than government?
Hold on, I'm just Googling industrial strategy here. Okay. So it says industrial strategy can be defined as the purpose-driven coordination by the state of its supply-side economic policies. Yeah, that sounds pretty good to me, actually. What I would simply call that, because I guess I was a young strategist at a different time, is absolutely. And one of the problems we have is we have a strategy with respect to one major element, which is childcare, which would have been the very top of my list. But there are other areas that need I love how I just learned what this term is, but I think I understand and just call it by a different word. But we do need strategy in other areas. So areas where we need a much better strategy, no question, infrastructure. As I was saying, we should not have bridges collapsing to major metropolises that are carrying massive segments of trade and then paralyzing an entire city because we didn't put money behind them. It's absolutely unacceptable. We should not have third world infrastructure to that capacity. We need better public transit systems.
Montreal's mob infrastructure has always been amazing, though. I lived there for 3 years, and I'm sure the 20 was under construction every day I lived there.
Well, in some ways, I was saying to my husband as we sat in traffic the other day, you know what? This is infrastructure development. Every pylon is infrastructure development and maybe what we could call industrial strategy. But infrastructure needs massive rev up. And what happens with infrastructure spending? What happens when you build better bridges? You get people to work faster. They don't waste as much time. You have productivity gains. So I said to you, what we're doing with human capital is akin to leaving oil in the ground and not exploiting it. One of the ways that you can exploit your human capital better, listen to me with all my jargon. Well, you pulled up industrial strategy first, so I don't feel so embarrassed. Is focus on infrastructure that allows better public transit, allows people to commute better, and reduces that. The other area we need is a better green transition. We talked about that, no question. And that has to be very purposeful, has to be coordinated with the provinces. And then we have to focus on what are we going to do with export activity. So, oil and gas is challenging because it does employ less than 1% of Canadians, but it's over half of, it's a third of our export development. So we're going to have to find substitutions. And I think those lie in services and tech. But if we're going to rev up those industries, then we require industrial strategy to do this. If we don't have these, then my great fear, this is not just a Canadian fear, my biggest fear is that we never effectively return to an environment where the private sector takes over from the public sector. There are areas we know are not effective via private markets. Childcare is one of those areas. Market-driven solutions just don't work. I say that as a dark-hearted base reader, okay? But there are other areas where we could actually see a transition from government to private sector that must happen in the next, I would say, 3 to 5 years, maybe 5 to 7 years, or we are going to be trapped in an environment where our government is probably too large. We have reduced productivity. We have reduced GDP over that timeline. So I am giving this government another year. Let's get through COVID. Let's get vaccinations in arms. Let's have a successful reopen. Let's solve supply chain disputes. Please build the bridge so that I can get to my child's daycare on time and not take 45 minutes to get there. Let's get through that. Focus on childcare. And then let's move forward with industrial strategy. To your point, will be absolutely necessary.
But our business community doesn't do fuck nothing, does it? They don't invest in anything. I mean, I've seen you criticizing the lack of business investment. And I remember years ago, Mark Carney talking about dead money in Canadian business accounts.
think the term that I used was a little more G-rated, and it was serial disappointment is the way that I tend to put it. So why is this happening? We cannot have corporate competitiveness in Canada. Let's put aside taxes. Let's just put aside taxes for 1 second. Maybe we're going to be aided because the US may raise corporate taxes here. In order to have very good corporate competitiveness, people have to want to live and work in Canada and enjoy their life here. I love Canada. I love it. But people are not going to want to stay here if it costs them $3,500 to live in a tiny place where they don't have a home office, $2,000 a kid to go to daycare. They can't get access to a variety of things they want to do, gas prices, food prices, even just things like I have friends that are moving to the US, and I said, what are you most looking forward to? And they said, I'm really looking forward to just having multiple sizes of Gatorade. In the US, they always have multiple sizes of things. Here I have one choice, maybe two choices. So, we have to make it a place where people want to live and work, and it's just not going to cut it that you can have poutine in Montreal or that BC is the most beautiful place on the planet. We have to make it actually affordable to live here. For that reason, the government has to get involved in housing and fix the affordability crisis. We have to get to a place where childcare is making it more income to lifestyle adjusted. And we have to encourage big multinational companies to be excited about being based in places like Calgary and Montreal. And if we do that, that's a strategy that can help us over the long term. But simply, at this point, I understand we're in a global financial crisis, or not a financial crisis, we're in a global recession, one thing at a time. I hope the conversations behind the scenes are on these topics.
Excellent. Your friends moving to the States, I'm thinking, on the one hand, high probability the person you rear-ended is carrying a weapon. On the other hand, different sizes of Gatorade. Let's try to figure.
Well, you've proved my point, which is what are the things you're thinking about where you want to live. And believe it or not, it can be things like that. So how do we capitalize on the things that make Canada great, and why do we want people to live here? How do we make it so you don't just want to live here, but you want to have a ton of babies? The concept scares me personally. I have one kid. I'm so tired. I don't know how to do it. But we have to really facilitate that. And that's how you develop a prosperous economy over time.
Thank you so much for coming on. This was awesome. I could keep going, but apparently audiences really sort of, even an hour, we're pushing them. But I loved this conversation. Thank you.
Well,
so smart.
Thank you so much for having me. You always ask questions that then I take down all these notes and then I go write different research reports. So if you see me using the term industrial strategy in a report, you'll know it's because of you.
I'm still waiting for you to cite Lester Thorough in your work.
Oh, no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Listen, thank you so much. I'm going to impose on you again in the future to come back and give us an update on what's going on.
It would be an honor. Thank you so much.
Right. All right. Go Habs, go. Well, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is having its big annual meeting this week. Virtually, of course. I will be so happy when we can stop adding that phrase to the end of sentences. Anyway, CN is a major sponsor of the Federation's conference. It should be obvious why. Hundreds of cities, towns, and Indigenous communities lie along CN's network, and the level of mutual reliance is profound. Simply put, CN is essential to many of those communities, and they are most definitely essential to CN. Over its more than 100 years of operation, CN has learned that the goodwill of all the neighbors along its tracks is vital to the smooth operation of the railway. So CN pitches in. It's determined to be a dependable neighbor and has made some serious investments to ensure just that. Every year, CN helps train thousands of first responders. That makes the communities through which our trains roll safer. CN operates sponsorship and donation programs. It supports children's hospitals and universities and youth organizations. It participates in programs to help victims of domestic abuse. It gives back. The Canadian Municipalities Conference will be looking back at 2020 and trying to figure out the smartest way to make a big comeback this year. CN humbly suggests that we all had to redefine who was essential during the hard times. the good neighbors were. Let's keep that in mind when the good times return. So, it's Tuesday morning, which means it is the political panel with Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid. My God, we're looking happy this morning, aren't we? We've got some grins on our faces this
Who are you wearing, Jenni?
I felt I could bring it back out. In Christ we trust.
Yep. As far as I'm concerned, Mats Naslund got us through this series. I wore my Mats jersey every game. I don't bring out the big guns till later in the playoffs. You know, my Lafleur jersey doesn't come out in the first round. But nonetheless,
I got my Lafleur.
What a night!
I've got my Lafleur on because
well, that probably helped.
Yeah, but I didn't wear them last night. Last night we had a very specific ritual because we found when we wore the sweaters earlier in the week, the Habs lost. So we had to dispense with the sweaters and go to other rituals in order to summon the ghosts, and it worked. It took us a while, but we found a way to make it work.
Well, Scott, I was worried when you posted the picture, you were missing a boy, and I was like, oh fuck, if the Reids fuck this up.
I was a little nervous about that. He couldn't be there, so we had his copy. We had his sweater signed by Henri Richard, the pocket rocket, who was Will's favorite player when he was a kid, and Ken Dryden arranged for Henri Richard to sign it for him. So we had that as the stand-in for Will last night, and that helped to summon the ghosts.
Well, I'm shocked at how quiet a lot of my family and friends that cheer for the Leafs are, because I believe if Game 7 had gone a different way, I believe the messages would be a lot different than what I'm doing to them. I'm not actually sending any messages.
Jenni, whatever I can claim credit for Naslund, and Scott can claim credit for Lafleur or whatever. But whatever Scott and I have been cheering for the Habs this hard every year, and it doesn't usually result this way. So whatever you're doing is obviously making the difference. So I don't know what your game ritual is, but you keep that up.
Yeah, but I've been a long time. It's not like I've been cheering for the Leafs or the Habs like this since I was like 8 years old. So it's been a long drought for me as well. But this is listen, the first playoff series I can remember between these two teams. I was 2 the last time this happened. So it was very exciting, but there's a lot of questions. I know we're not trying to turn this into a hockey pod, but there's
why not? I'm all for that.
Why
not? The Leafs coach, I always forget his name. What's his name?
Keefe.
Sheldon Keefe.
I don't know why he didn't change up some of the lines. Like why keep Marner and Matthews together? Like I know they're best friends. They drink beer. They play Xbox together. They're really into the sniffing salts because every time they pan to Marner on the bench, he had it like right up his nose. I'm not sure why not make those changes, especially going into last night's game. What did they have to lose? Well,
I take particular delight. I take particular delight. My brother William, who called me immediately as the game ended, and from Costa Rica, and we were talking about it. He was taking great joy in the fact that it's Galchenyuk's lazy pass that Caulfield intercepted in the overtime that turned the whole series around. The Leafs were obviously going to win that game in overtime. They'd scored 3 straight goals against us in the third period, had all the momentum coming into overtime. Series was going to be over until he makes that pass, and those guys take off. The Leafs never led again after that moment.
This is the consistency you're looking for in a top 5 draft pick, and Galchenyuk has demonstrated it city to city, game to game, year to year. You can count on him, and God bless him. As soon as he put that Leafs jersey on, he started to really help us.
Exactly, and look at so you got Price, who's on his game. You've got Caulfield and Suzuki, young guys coming up. Listen, the reason that Matthews hardly got a stick on the puck was because of Gallagher, who just like was a fly, like buzzing about his ear for the entire series. So it's a good team. I liked what I saw. So we'll see. There's the rest of the the rest of the remaining teams are all like really playing amazing fucking hockey. So anyways,
I just have one reservation about this win. and because I'm delighted, and it was emotional and satisfying and all that you could possibly want as a hockey fan for the Habs. But this cannot come at the price of rewarding Bergevin with a new contract. He must still go.
Oh no!
He
He's got
built
another 5
this
years.
shitty team that somehow beat the Leafs. No more. Go away. Did you see what he was wearing last night? He was dressed up like a Batman villain. He in that sort of candy apple red outfit of his. Just the guy. I think he pays more attention to his tailor than he does.
He guaranteed himself another 5 years last night. Let's face it. We're stuck with. All right, let's move quickly from the sublime to the horrific. We've got politics to talk about this week. This isn't it. This is just something that on any show like this has to be acknowledged, and that is the discovery of the mass burial ground at the residential school in British Columbia, and it's something that has to. I mean, maybe it won't because we're so amazingly good at denial and overlooking things, but it has to be something that shakes the way people understand the history of the country and the history of our relationship with Indigenous people. Like it is shocking.
Yeah, and that discovery of 215 tossed away, taken out like trash children, occurred on Friday, and it's Tuesday. And I sure hope we don't get to this Friday without an announcement from the federal government saying that at minimum, one concrete action that would be taken is to finally accept the recommendation from the Royal Commission, from Marie Sinclair's commission, saying, let's go find all those bodies. Let's go find those kids. Let's do the full search. I think they budgeted at $1.5 million. I mean, that's how much these guys spend on ramen noodles these days. We should be out there looking for every single one of these bodies. We should be doing everything we can to trace, the provenance of those remains and finding out what families they came from. There are 215 families that don't know what happened to one of their children. They just know that at some point they went away and did not come back. And it's staggering to me. I don't know how you settle these accounts. I don't know what the full range of action required would be. I mean, greater accountability, obviously. I think there's, still a number of institutions, the federal government among them, but certainly United Church, Catholic Church, Anglican Church, that need to make a fuller accounting for their role. But I think at minimum, can't the government stand up? Can't the Prime Minister stand up right away? I don't even understand why it's taken this long and say, all right, we're going to go find out where those kids are, and we're going to do everything we can to find out where they came from and what happened to them.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I agree wholeheartedly with Scott. I think that other residential school locations where they were should exactly as you said, go and see if this horrific discovery is an anomaly, which unfortunately I don't think that it probably is. And I agree wholeheartedly with trying to identify and be able to tell the families what happened to, as you said, Scott, their children as young as 3 that went into a institution and never came out, and probably these families were told nothing. Maybe they were told their kids ran away or what have you. And so I agree. I 100% with everything you just said.
When I did that Through the Looking Glass series on race in Canada, those focus groups, and when I was talking to the Indigenous Canadians, they talked about how their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, none of them had ever talked about what went on in the residential schools. Like, this was just history that was lost to these families from the people who survived them, from the people who came back. Like, they talked about it like people returning from war, who they just went through something so horrific that they were never going to broach that subject again with anybody or bring it up. It is just staggering what must have gone on in those schools, and boy, what a reflection on us as a people.
Well, the testimonials in that commission report, I just want to add one thing. Like, those testimonials in the commission report are truly affecting to read, and And when you read through those or you talk to people that live through the scoop, you ended up with villages. You might have 180 or 200 people living in a place, and then suddenly there's no children. A combination of them just saying, well, we're going to take them, and families feeling that it was the right thing to do and it would provide their children with a better lease on life. But suddenly you've got a village where there's no noise of children. There's just adults. And like, that's a monster movie. That's a horrifying thing. It's just, anyway, something else.
Yeah. Okay, let's summon up the will to talk about politics.
All right.
Not the hottest week. Hey, one of the things that caught my eye this week, though, was a new poll. I think it was by Leger in Ontario that showed the Ford Conservatives with a healthy lead over their rivals. 34% to, I think, 26% for the Liberals and 25% for the NDP. So the good news for Ford in that is that he seems to have found a base, and it's not a bad one, 34%. I mean, I presume that that's sort of, at this point in things, the bottom. The bad news is you can't win with 34% of the vote because the other non-Ford vote's going to consolidate at some point. So when I see 34, 26, 25, my mind immediately turns to who's going to win the battle between the Liberals and the NDP to be the challenger to Ford.
Well, Horvat's, if the leadership numbers in that poll, Horvat's numbers are horrible, as well as Doug's. Doug's at a 58% on a disapproval rating. So one would say that that's actually good news for Del Duca in terms of the fact that the sitting premier and his main opposition opponent, you could say to the left of things, and who's been leader for well over a decade, is not getting any traction either.
Right.
I want to start by saying I think it's worth, just as a note, to ask ourselves whether we should give a bit of props to Corey Tenek and Nick Cavalis. Because a month ago, when they were putting these ads out, they took Ford after that horrific stretch with the lockdown. They took him off the podium and basically put him into witness protection for 3 weeks. He's barely been out since, only once or twice. And I would like to say, not to go back to hockey. Yeah.
On the start of the series, he asked Marner and Matthews to go out and score for him. And last night, he asked Leafs Nation from Ford Nation to bring it on home. Yeah.
No, he's a real rabbit's foot, that guy. But I just think I remain unconvinced that the ads have had much impact, but I do think. So I would attribute it more to the tactical decision of just take Ford's face off of TV, get out of people's grill, because people were at a point where they were like pointing the finger at CP24 and going, that fucking guy, that's the guy I want to get, that's the neck I want to wring. So I think it was a good tactical retreat. So I give them some credit for stabilizing things, because I do think it feels like they kind of have stabilized stuff. That being said, everything you say is exactly right, David. I mean, 26-25 means that there's an opportunity for one of these opposition parties to consolidate. When does that happen? Probably not until the campaign. But what do you do? And this is the alchemy of the pre-writ period 1 year in advance. What are the things you do that might be invisible in terms of immediate impact now, but that advantage your opportunities of being the winner of that consolidation race come the campaign? And I think one of the big question marks, and Jenni puts her finger on it, one of the big question marks for Del Duca is, what do you do with Del Duca? Like, he's the leader of the third party. So by definition, he's going to have an enormously difficult time getting attention, getting traction with people. But how do you introduce him to people? How do you start to think about the story of Del Duca in a way that when cameras are on him and voters are thinking about him, that they'll be receptive to what they hear? What kind of foundation do you try to build now that osmotically benefits you later? And I think that's an unanswered question, but I really think that the Liberals have got to say, we are going to position this guy, because he's not a thoroughbred. He's a big clunking guy with no hair and big framey glasses, and no, he's not exactly going up against Bridget Bardot and Doug Ford either. But so it's not going to be the athleticism, youth, energy, and good looks of a Trudeau, but it doesn't have to be. So how do they create a foundation around that guy in terms of who he is and what he stands for and what he represents that'll allow people to be comfortable coming there and thinking to yourself, I can't just go fishing in the conservative pond, in the suburban pond. I got to get some of that 24% from the NDP column. And so I think that's what the summer's job is for the Liberals, is find a way to tell people about Del Duca in a fashion that'll pay off come the election campaign.
But do you really want to highlight? So the Liberal Party of Canada brand, you guys have one of the best brands in the Western world, if not the most strongest if not the strongest, one of the strongest brands. And so do you not want to turn this into a Liberal Party of Ontario versus Doug Ford fight? You don't want to put up a Stephen Del Duca versus a Doug Ford. Doug will be the. I still maintain. I think there's so much underlining in this poll that has him at 34%. He hasn't really dropped much lower than that in a lot of the polls. So I don't think it's like, I think on the surface it looks like it's good for Ford. I'm not sure that I'm really not sure that it is, now that we're going to be 1 month as of Thursday into will be E-Day. So we're into the year stretch pretty much now. But if you have, if you're, it's kind of, and we've talked about it on the pod, it is when we campaigned against you guys in 2004 and in 2006. We weren't framing it Stephen Harper versus Paul Martin. We were forming it the Conservative Party of Canada versus Paul Martin and the Liberals. So there's got to be some way that if you're the Liberals, you're trying to figure out a way that you're trying to kind of dovetail or cling on to the be the fish that clings on to the whale that is Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada right now, especially like in the province of Ontario.
I guess
I think the most interesting thing might be, what did the NDP do? What do the NDP do? Because my feeling that the answer to your question, Scott, builds off Jenni, which is, I think the NDP are the safety valve for the Liberals. I mean, the reason the NDP were in it in the last election was because it didn't look like we could beat Ford. So people abandoned us to another party that might be able to beat Ford. But I think on balance, Liberals the default position in Ontario, and the NDP are only credible when the Liberals not credible, they're competitive when the Liberals don't look like they can win. So surely I would say the biggest job for the Del Duca Liberals is to look like they are bigger and more ready to govern than their 8 seats and third party status would suggest. They've got to look like the Liberal Party, not like the rump that I left them. So I think that the question becomes, what do the NDP need to do to break that up? What could they possibly do in the period between now and the election to vault past the Liberals and solidify themselves as the alternative?
Well, I'll give you an obvious answer, but I mean, it's probably not one they'll want to reach for or can reach for.
Replace their leader. I think that she's a proven commodity, and I also think, by the way, beyond just glibly saying that, because I do think that she's a deficient political commodity, I think that there would be excitement generated by that, and it would capture a measure of attention, and people will go, oh, okay, so there's a new person on the block, and let's have a look at them, and they might get more than their fair share of interest, and that could lead into the kind of momentum that you're talking about, where they go, well, maybe, people might start saying, well, maybe that's the kind of person we could rally around if they choose someone with a little bit of game. And I think there are people in that caucus, like Merritt Stiles and stuff, that could put that kind of chemistry together. But I doubt they'll do that. And so I think they'll kind of do what they've done, which is they just sort of lumber along. And I doubt that it'll be terribly effective. But I just want to say on Jenni's question, this is this tough strategic challenge all the time. How much do you put the leader up front versus the brand name and all that? I just don't think that there's a choice. I don't think you're going to get to election day without people coming to a point of view about Del Duca. And I think if you're the Ontario Liberals, you want to wring every ounce of benefit out of the brand.
But either for offensive or at minimum for defensive purposes, you're going to have to introduce him to people and create a storyline around him that at minimum is sturdy enough to withstand the attacks that will inevitably come from the likes of Corey and Nick. So I don't think there's any getting around that job of work.
Okay, when you look at this, when you look at these numbers, at this point in time, you think Ford gets reelected or doesn't get reelected?
Well, as I said, I think it's going to be hard for a lot of incumbent governments at that stretch of the electoral cycle. I think that there's a reason why Trudeau and his people are looking at going as soon as possible. There's a reason why BC went, Horgan went when he did. I think that the economy, Canada's economy is very, very shaky right now, and people vote with their pocketbooks, with their checkbooks, more than they vote with anything else. And I think that unfortunately for the Ford government, where they're going to be in their cycle could be when we're facing challenges economically. But unlike Trudeau, unlike governments that have that are in minorities, it would be very hard for him to pull the trigger early to try to go, especially considering Ontario is the most locked down province in the country. As the other provinces start to open, you see Alberta, hair salons, restaurant patios. Their stage 1 is opening. Their stage 2 is going to open in another week or so. By the time Ontario hits what Christine Elliott said yesterday is stage 2, or stage 1, whatever the number is for this one, essentially the rest of the country is going to be head and shoulders above where Ontario is. So Doug doesn't even have, his team doesn't have, I think, that ability to say, okay, well, everyone else is going, so we're going to go too.
So 2 things. One is a question to you, Jenni, but first, I think that very same point that Jenni makes also works in reverse. I mean, we just don't know how the world will unfold. We know it will be dynamic. So we know that we will come out of this, presumably, and we know that the economy should come roaring back. But is that going to be a sugar high? Like, are we going to end up with a spike in economic activity and then it drops down and we end up settling at a level that's lower than where it was previously, and governments start to get blamed for it? And the case for Trudeau going sooner rather than later, and the case for Ford being stuck dealing with it at a bad part of the cycle? Or are we going to find that it sustains and that, by the time we get to next summer, people are in a really good mood. They've had 8 months of really strong economic activity. It's an open summer. Life is back. People are traveling and they feel good, and maybe he becomes a beneficiary of that. So it's so fundamental, what economic performance to the success of, I think, particularly of the provincial government, particularly in this circumstance coming out of this. I think that he's likely to be punished severely or rewarded handsomely, depending upon how those macroeconomic trends work out. But the second thing I have is to David's question of will Ford get reelected? My answer is probably not, at least not with a majority. So I think he'll end up getting struck back to a minority position at worst, or he'll get at best, or he'll get beat. But my question for you, Jenni, is this: and I know it's a shitty question, I know it's like impossible to answer, but if he's talking about shuffling the cabinet. There's a story in today's Toronto Star by our pal Rob Benzie talking about shuffling the cabinet. You've got people off the record in his office talking very, I think, unwisely about, we got to get rid of all these shitty old cabinet ministers and get brand new, better cabinet ministers, right? And where meanwhile, like, his caucus and cabinet are wandering around going, maybe we're not the fucking problem here, right? So I do think they're playing with matches around that, but he's going to shuffle cabinet, and that's going to create some disaffection. Yeah, you get new, but as we all know, caucus members who thought, my number is going to be up, and then they don't go in, they feel aggrieved. The people who are bumped out, they feel aggrieved. There's often, Chrétien used to make this joke that there was often more risk in shuffling the cabinet than benefit, because you alienate more people than you reward. And I guess so he goes through that. If the economy's not doing great, and if the numbers are not good for him, and if his personal numbers are bad, and he continues to bumble around like the A&W root beer bear, does his own caucus and cabinet go, hey, buddy, it's time to meet behind the Burger King at midnight, and kapang with the shovel goes forward? Do you think that?
Well,
think that's a possibility?
Look at this. Look at the
In favor of Patrick Brown. In favor, they'll bring back Patrick Brown, who's been launching a major charm offensive out of Brampton. There,
he deserves the bouquet of the week, for that whole let the frontliners into the Scotiabank Arena. They turn around, they do it. It was the greatest troll on Ford I'd ever seen. But does Ford is there a chance that Ford gets removed, or is it just too hard to pull off?
Look at the history of the party, this caucus, and what they've done with and what they do with leaders. That when they turn quickly. John Tory, Tim Hudak, Patrick Brown, and I agree with you in terms of the unnamed sources in the Benzie story. I think that it's our cabinet's too old, it's too white, it's got too many people that have been elected for a long time. Someone went as far as to actually name names, which is extremely dangerous in terms of who they're looking at removing, especially when these caucus members are very well liked these cabinet ministers are very well liked within the party, very well regarded, and in most cases, good cabinet ministers. So I think that article was playing with fire. I have no. It always boggles my mind when people talk strategy instead of just doing it.
I'll only make one prediction. If Ford were to step down and be removed, and there would be a leadership, Christine Elliott will run, be the front runner, and lose.
That's a given.
She hasn't even indicated whether she's going to run for the ledge. And I do not. My prediction would be if there is a leadership race, I don't think Christine will run on this one.
Come on, I think David's right. It's an eternal truth, right? We can all go away for decades and have careers in construction. We'll come back here in 2070 and she'll have announced that she's coming out of retirement to run for the leadership. I'm looking forward to coming second for the 13th consecutive time.
So things were so slow in federal politics this week that all the news is out of the committees. And first of all, there was a very unusual leak out of a committee this week. Come on, Scott, you're supposed to pounce on that.
I'm not. I'm off the leak jokes. I'm not. Can we?
Was it a committee? Okay, was it a committee or was it a vote?
I think it was a committee hearing. It really doesn't matter what it was. It was long enough that it required a cup. Sustenance. Coffee or juice.
He said he's going to be seeking assistance, Scott. Has he reached out to you?
Yes, and we're working together. We have a 7-step plan. It begins with the camera. Works its way progressively down toward your haunches. I don't know. I guess we're gonna get what are we gonna get shade because we're making fun of somebody's mental health challenge. Is this guy got a fetish? I don't know. What the fuck is going on here?
His statement basically said this was a mistake. Didn't want to end the conversation or didn't want to miss anything, and I'm seeking help. It's kind of like. He sent his draft statement to the PMO. Brian Clow got aired it and said, good. Now I'm seeking help and I'm going away for an indefinite period of time.
By the way, I'm no longer the parliamentary secretary. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. The top is I'm resigning as parliamentary secretary. The bottom is I'm seeking assistance, and all the other stuff in the middle is just I didn't do anything wrong, and there's nothing much going on here. But I imagine that they did write the rest of that paragraph, I'm seeking assistance, and then he elaborated what he was seeking assistance for and how he would go about seeking that assistance. And I think that somebody looked at it and said, "We gotta get rid of all these sentences. These are no good. These sentences." I have a predilection toward wandering around naked, protesting that it was by accident, giggling into my shoulder as it's super weird. It's super weird. And
you've also then had your colleagues go out. I think it was.
How do they feel,
Rodriguez that went out and basically we need an investigation. This is disseminating porn, and this poor guy, he's a victim. And now these guys that have been defending him for a month and trying to push this angle are kind of well. Thanks.
I feel bad for those guys. I mean, they seem like they had a point. And at first, if it was just an accident, the guy went for a run. It was like, whoops, a camera accident. Then it seems kind of like a shitty thing to do. And now you're like, okay, but the same accident keeps happening here, right? We got a tale of tubing. I just, what do you do? What do you do with that? What do you do with that?
It's got to be good news for Steve McKinnon somehow. Go, Steve. Not the Bruins, though.
Yeah, keep your pants on, buddy.
Yeah.
Your advice as to how to become the king of the region that that you represent for the party: keep your pants on.
Yes. Or the camera off. One or the other, but you can't do both.
Amazing how often that advice is ignored. So, should we get into it? The other news at the committee this week was that the industry committee, and I think Mr. Poilievre specifically, summoned Mark Carney to appear along with 5 other people to speak to the subject of sustainable growth. Not surprisingly to anybody, the exchanges between Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney turned out to be the highlight of the show. The other people were there.
It seems surprising to Mark Carney that there was going to be an exchange, which was kind of surprising to me.
All right, roll, Jenni. Take your first run.
You have a quote. Like I'm not really sure what the story is, except that
How do you think it went?
I think it went poorly for Mark Carney. I think that he was showing up at a committee. He's now, we've talked about this, he's partisan. He is not the esteemed former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. And he showed up at a parliamentary committee. He knew that the person leading the other side for the parliamentary committee was Pierre Poilievre. And he showed up seemingly woefully unprepared. He didn't seem to have any answers. And the questions were pretty straightforward. He was coming to talk about sustainability and in his role as the vice president of ESG for Brookfield, and was asked some very pointed questions about things that would matter if you were looking at ESG for investing in a company, and either did not have the answers or had answers that seemed very unsatisfactory. So, he didn't know if the polysilicon made in solar panels was mined in China. Most of the world's polysilicon is mined in China using coal-powered plants and slave labor. That doesn't sound very ESG to me at all. He talked about not supporting some Western pipelines when Brookfield invests in Latin America and Middle East pipelines. So I'm surprised that Mark Carney showed up at a committee now being he's out and about as a liberal, rumored to want to eventually be leader, rumored to be running in the election, and be so woefully unprepared on what should be a subject matter that he should be very prepared on.
Well, I'm a big fan, so I'm going to hold my fire for a second. Scott, what was your take on this?
Man, I'm almost reluctant to get into this. I thought that Poilievre sounded like a complete cock. And I just did. I just think, and it makes me fret for how I look at politics, because I hear everything that Jenni said, and I know she's longtime friends with Pierre. And I know that most of the conservatives in my social media streams were saying the same things. They were wildly enthusiastic about Pierre's performance. They appear to be emphatic and sincere in their view that Carney got beaten up. I couldn't have seen it more differently. I thought that Carney looked like he was tolerant of a cheap and personal and silly performance. And I thought that he soldiered through it. He gave it enough rope. And then finally, at the end, he protested the manner in which he'd been treated, but not in a haughty way, in a way that I thought looked like he just slapped Poilievre and made him look small. And so that's my take. And I thought that Poilievre came off intensely unlikable and looked cheap and narrow and small. But conservatives don't see it that way, or at least a bunch of conservatives that I know don't see it that way.
Okay, listen. Okay, but you guys, my guess is you guys love Carney. You would love for him to run in leadership because you both want to work for him. So I'm
not even talking about Carney. I'm talking about Pierre, to be all honest.
But let's talk about Carney. If he wants to run for parliament, what did you say?
I said nothing. Forget it. Go on.
If he wants to run for parliament, does he not have to answer questions? He's written a book. He is spouting his entire, like right now, he's the UN rapporteur to climate change, what have you. Are these not legitimate questions for someone that's dipping their toe into politics that they have to answer about the work that they're currently doing? That seems in complete opposition to what they actually preach. He's definitely not practicing what he preaches.
For sure. But he has to answer questions. But my point is this, and I want to return to it. I think that Poilievre, in one few-minute session, distilled and displayed what is, I think, so limiting for the Conservative Party at present. I think that it was wildly rewarding for Poilievre to take that positioning among Conservatives. I don't think that any objective observer came away saying, wow, I think that guy's better than that guy. I think that guy performed in a way that makes me more attracted to his political party than this guy. So I don't think it ended up being about Carney. I think it ended up being about Poilievre. And I'm just at a loss to say how that works for the Conservative Party and how it works for Pierre Poilievre. On a personal level, if the guy has future ambitions, you got to attract more people. It can't just be playing to the bleachers. And I just think he comes off as insanely, detestably unlikable, and I just don't think that's a recipe for future success.
Well, I'm sure he'll be listening to your advice looking for it with bated breath. But the fact of the matter is, Scott, is our committee hearings aren't actually for the average person. Carney is now making his foray into the political class watching, the chattering class, and the media. And he's already gotten media attention. The kid gloves that he gets here in Canada is a lot different than what he got into his he was the governor of the Bank of London. He actually was wildly political in terms of being anti-Brexit, and the bank actually put out several statements and factums, including saying there was going to be a recession that they completely had to walk back on. And he was criticized in the media for even dipping his toe in there. And so he's done a foray. It's just because you don't like it doesn't mean that these questions have to be answered. And I'm sorry, David, I know you've been trying to get in because we don't have a lot of time.
No, I'm fine with that. Jenni. I'm curious about, I think he has to answer questions for sure, and lots of them. Many he hasn't been asked yet. And I think you could argue that he, ultimately needs to become a sharper political communicator than he was able to be in some segments of that exchange. But, I'm struggling to say this, so let me just say it. Okay, I don't really know why Mr. Poilievre wants to get him gotcha on how many birds have your windmills killed, when there's a real substantive discussion to be had between a conservative and Mark Carney about Carney's views about the market, about Carney's views about government and what its role and size ought to be, about how to deal with climate change. I mean, Stephen Harper could have a real substantive discussion and debate with Mark Carney. I just don't think that was it in that exchange. And I'm sort of with Scott. But everything that I brought up were stuff that actually affects Canadians or the Canadian government.
I just, in all honesty, I think it's a tone and motivation thing. Like,
of course,
if I was working for
always think it's a tone and motivation thing.
Okay, well,
that's why you love Doug. That's why you love Doug Ford for the year of the pandemic.
Okay, well, I'll finish my point, and then you can slam me. My point is this. I don't think that Pierre Poilievre looked like he was interested in the issues. I don't think that Pierre Poilievre looked like he was serious. I think that he looked cheap and political. And if I'm Pierre Poilievre, I want someone to do that to Carney. I want someone to rough him up as much as possible. I'm not sure I want to be that guy. I don't want to always be the guy holding the hatchet if one day I want to hold the scepter. So again, you can laugh and say, well, Pierre Poilievre doesn't give a shit what Scott Reid thinks. I'm positive that's true. But what I think is he's doing it exactly the wrong way.
Okay. But you guys are very touchy on Carney. Jeez.
Well, I mean, you're the one who's running around like a bear away from a hornet's nest. You guys are scared shitless of him. He was terrible in London and here, and then he's a partisan now. You guys smell like fear.
Pointing something out. No, I would, as I've said before, I think Mark Carney seems like he'd be a good candidate to run again. He is absolutely no Justin Trudeau in terms of likability, political smarts, communications, and there is a graveyard of people who are very good at business and cannot get their head wrapped around politics because they think they're smarter than everyone else. And we've talked about them, Bill Marneau, Michael Ignatieff. So we'll see if Mark Carney will go down that route. But if he doesn't actually learn from the mistakes and he's coddled and basically just say by people and just told, oh, don't worry, nobody likes Poilievre. Don't worry about what he goes after you on. Your tone and tenor was great. Then he is never actually going to learn the game. Well,
that's not what I would say if I was talking to him. What I would say to him is, you got off lucky because Poilievre made himself so unlikable that your own blemishes were overlooked. And I think that if I was to, I've seen Carney in 3 performances recently, right? 1 at the Liberal Party convention when he gave that speech, 2 on this podcast, and 3 at that committee. I would say that his weakest performance was in the convention. His best performance was on the podcast, where he seemed natural and likable and smart and interesting. And the committee hearing was somewhere in the middle. I just think you guys can do a better job of roughing him up than was done the other day if you took a different tone and betrayed different motivations. I think you smell like fear when you go after him in those cheap and unserious ways.
Well, it's a battle that is likely to keep occurring. Certainly, Carney, if he didn't think he was in politics before he went to the industry committee, now understands that he's in politics.
So if we all think that there's going to be an election this fall, will Carney be a candidate, do we think?
If I were him, I wouldn't run. What's the plus side? So, So let's say he gets a seat and he wins. So he gets to sit in a cabinet. Chances are they don't make him finance minister. And then he sits around for Trudeau to retire. And then he essentially probably, if conventional wisdom hits, he has to sit and run against Chrystia Freeland. And he now then has to wear. So let's say the economy does take a turn for the worse. He then has to wear everything that this government has done. Is it not better for him to sit this one out, see what happens, and then run as leader from the outside? Because then every bad thing, everything that people can be unhappy about in your party or the Canadian public, he can go, I wasn't there. I knocked on doors for this candidate and that candidate, and I did my thing, but I wasn't part of the cabinet that made this decision or that decision or X, Y.
David, I bet that's interesting. I buy all that logic, but David, I bet $1 million you and I are thinking the same thing right now. And I bet what we're both thinking is Bob Rae 2004. If Bob Rae should have run in 2004.
2006. 2006.
2006, pardon me. 2006. 2006, if he had, then he would have become the leader. If he'd been a sitting caucus member in 2006, I think he would have won the leadership after that election. And the fact that he didn't, I think, really hard.
Little different because he hadn't even joined the party. Different because he hadn't even joined the party.
And the difference is you guys lost. So I think it's unlikely that Trudeau's going to lose the next election. Sure, maybe he goes to a minority.
I don't think he will either.
I think it'd still be a majority. We talked about this. At the very least, let's say he keeps his minority. It's a lot different, I think, coming in than winning a leadership race in a party that's not in government.
But I don't know if he's going to run, Scott. I don't know if he's going to run. I want him to run. And I hope he runs. And I hope Trudeau wants him to run. Not anything to do with the leadership, right?
Yeah.
that window's kind of closed, to be honest. The timing is all off for all the reasons that Jenni laid out.
Yeah.
The timing's all off on leadership. And, the best case scenario for either him or Freeland or anybody that replaces Trudeau is that in a Paul Martin-like way, you get to extend it by one term or by one election or something. But you're coming at the end of the cycle, and you will be lucky to have a term as prime minister at the end of that. So the question is, how much difference can he make right now? And every time I look at the guy or talk to the guy, I say, Mike, fuck, if he was in the cabinet, that cabinet would be way stronger. So he wants to make a difference in the world. I know he does. And I think that government's the place for him to do it. I hope he runs, and I hope the party wants him to run and puts him in a position where he can make it.
I'm in the same boat. I would advise him to run for two reasons. One, if he does have future ambitions, and notwithstanding all of those points, all of which I agree with, all the handicapping both of you laid out, it doesn't look good. Your mission can't just be to become prime minister, because that may well not happen. It just may not unfold that way. But if it is partly in your mind, then you need to get into parliament and get into cabinet and become better in the way that Jenni was talking about a minute ago. The guy needs to strengthen his skills, and you can only do that if you're in the game. You don't get better on the bench. And then secondly, I think that, if he can't be prime minister, if that's not going to work out, then cabinet is the best possible place to make a significant contribution to changing things. So I would I see no reason to not run if I'm him.
Excellent. All right, team, we're approaching the end of our session. Fun as it's been again. Jenni, do you got a hey you?
I do have a hey you, and it's almost broken record, but my hey you is to Doug and his cabinet, whoever they may be, in the next couple weeks. You bent to political pressure to allow 500 healthcare workers at the Leafs-Habs game last night. There's no rhyme or reason to it at all, except political pressure. But obviously it seems safe. Double vaccinated people can go to a hockey game. They should be able to go to restaurants and stores and what have you. And I think that Ontario's reopening plan is woefully slow. I think the whole announcing to announce something, I think it's time for Ontario to go the way of Quebec and BC and Alberta and Saskatchewan and all the other provinces that are opening up, and give an answer one way or another on schools. Let kids start playing baseball and soccer. Open up patios. Let people start living their life. Accelerate it. Don't wait for 2 weeks just to spite. Just because you've put it on a piece of paper. This government has changed their mind many times throughout the last 14 months. This is when they need to re-examine.
I never learned anything in school in a June in my life. Why would they send kids back to school in June?
Because so many families are so stressed with kids being online and in home, and they just don't have care options. I assume that's it, but that's 2-3 weeks. And it's good for kids. Yeah.
And kids are missing their friends.
Yeah.
Kids are like, I've talked to my family and friends that have kids, especially 10 and under. It's been real, it's been tough. Begging and crying that to let them go and play in the playground with a friend or two because they miss them so much. So I think that's why the government should let kids go back. June 29th is a long way away. Let them go back for 2 or 3 weeks.
I just hope to God, if they do it, that they put in some kind of mechanism for online learning, because I'm one of those parents that has the ability to keep the kids at home. It's not easy, it's not convenient, but I'd rather that than send them to school right now. I'd rather that I'm not comfortable sending them back. And I'm afraid that I won't have an option, because I think it's going to be like, well, if you want them with their class and their teacher, then you're going to have to send them to school. Otherwise, they go into trying to join the online learning circuit that's already been de-streamed in some other way, and it won't be available. So I'll be interested in those options if they do recall schools.
You got a hey you, Scott?
I do. My hey you is to Chrystia Freeland and Ahmad Hassan. Guys, it's been 42 days since the federal budget. And do you remember the federal budget? The federal budget included a commitment to work on $10 a day childcare. It was going to be an economic prescription. It was going to be a social prescription. It was going to be well funded, and you were going to use the power of the federal buck to get those provinces to sign on and to create a system across the country. And in the 42 days since the federal budget, there hasn't been one single agreement. We haven't gotten early momentum with some Atlantic provinces signing on. We haven't managed to bring over the whale that is BC, much less try to tackle the province of Ontario. So I just don't understand, why aren't we working on this? I believe that this should be central, not only to the government's agenda from a policy perspective, but it should be central to the government's political prescription, because the next election has to be about what comes next and it's not what's come before. And I think that childcare is a winner. And they don't appear to be doing anything after April 19th on childcare. Now, maybe there's work going on behind the scenes and it's all quiet to us, but I would have expected some momentum and early signings. By now, there are none. I want to see some. I think we're missing a huge opportunity. And I know you're going to be talking to Frances Donald later. She's talked about it from an economic perspective, how important it is. I hope to God that she and others who have the ear of the minister are putting pressure on her, because right now it feels like it was something that was announced but not done. And that's no good.
Yeah, it's been awfully quiet. It's been awfully quiet on that front for sure. My hey you goes out to the Honorable Carolyn Bennett, a friend of mine. And Carolyn is the right person for this moment. She's a genuinely caring, empathetic person. And Carolyn, this situation with the residential schools is a moment. First of all, do right by all the kids and all the families, not just at that school, but everywhere in the country. And second of all, seize this moment to do what has to be done, whether it's in school curriculums or elsewhere, to ensure that knowledge of this horror that went on in our country is understood by everybody. Because reconciliation isn't really possible until everybody understands what happened. And we're still at the truth phase of truth and reconciliation. So, Carolyn, I know you're up to this, but this is your moment. Take this and run with it. Thank you two for today. It was great, and especially on some difficult subjects. You know, it's not every week somebody pees in a committee hearing.
No.
So.
No. Caught. Gets caught peeing in a cup in a committee hearing.
Gets caught peeing. That's right. Anyway, what a glorious week we've had. What a glorious night we had last night. Go Habs.
Go Habs. Go.
Go Habs. Go. Thank you both for being here. Thank you everybody for listening. Thank you our presenting sponsor TELUS and CN Rail, our sponsor. Thank you all for listening, and the people that responded to my plea for ratings and reviews last week, and there were a lot of you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's very touching, the number of you that took the time and effort to do that. We'll be back next week. Maybe sad about hockey, but we'll be back next week. See you then.